Tonight, we're going to have a presentation by Michael Beck, who has spent years with Endangered Habitat, not just will actually officially introduce them. That's still on rotate. So there's a slide here I put in especially for Michael. There it is. This is the Portuguese Bend portion of the Palos Verdes Nature Preserve. And this is the endangered Palos Verdes blue butterfly. Both of these are accommodated in the NCCP, Natural Communities Conservation Plan. And when I was working for the Conservancy, we spent time with this. And it was through efforts like Michael and Jess and everybody else back then that enabled us to have this legislation to do what we wanted to do. So this is a transect set up to monitor the progress. It was not very good at that point in time. It was 2015. And nowadays, the hike down in there is going to look very different from that. Next slide, please. Introduction by Jess. And thank you, Jess. He can do a much better job than me here.
Thank you. Get out of the way of the slide here. I'm glad you're all here. I have heroes in the world. And tonight you're going to hear from one of them, Michael Beck. I met him a third of a century ago when we formed the Endangered Habitats League. And Michael became the director for San Diego County. At the time, he was a woodworker, doing fine cabinetry type of work. That's what he wanted to do, an artist working. If I had told him then that you're going to be one of the great land development dealers in San Diego County, and that you would be eventually chair of the planning commission, he would have said, you're crazy. But in fact, that's what's happened. And I'm going to let Michael discuss the Endangered Habitats Conservancy, which is the organization that he runs right now. And it is one that is designed to put together habitat preserves, such as the one that Anne mentioned here on the Palos Verdes Peninsula. They all came out of the same process, working together. Michael and I were on the Endangered Habitats League, and we still are on both of us are on the board today, a third of a century later. So anyway, I will let Michael tell you about the Endangered Habitats Conservancy and describe some of the work that's been done. Here he is, Michael.
Well, good evening, everybody. Can you hear me? I keep having trouble. Okay, excellent. Maybe somebody can help guide me on how to share the screen so I can give a bit of a presentation. Well, I'm glad to be with you tonight, and you know, we all have shared values related to conservation, and what I'm going to describe is kind of a subset of our work, but it's on the implementation side of the NCCP. And as Jess alluded to, we formed Endangered Habitats League is kind of a policy organization, and Endangered Habitats Conservancy is implementation. That's a simple way to describe the relationship between the two organizations. And I'm the San Diego director of EHL, and I run the Conservancy. So if we can share the screen, how do I do that? I'm going to start kind of concentric circles, start on the largest context. So if I could have the first slide, which is the regional NCCP.
Can everyone see okay, the shared screen?
That's good.
Yes, it looked good. Thank you.
No worries. Perfect.
Okay, this is San Diego County, and the purplish color in the southwest third of the county is the MSCP South, and that's where I'm going to focus a lot of my discussion tonight. The green area is MSCP North, and the area to the east is the MSCP East. And as you can see, it's takes up a lot of the county, which is really good. Just because it's colored doesn't mean there's no development in there, but I'll show you a subset of this map in a moment. But I would want to at least kind of acknowledge the amazing fact that when we're done, the reserve system will probably be 500,000 or 600,000 acres. And in total, 65 to 70% of San Diego County will be conserved open space, which is pretty amazing considering it's the tail end of Southern California. Okay, next slide. So this is what I just referred to in that purple area. This is the MSCP South. This is a map I like to use because it's so clean and simple to interpret. The dark green areas is the assembled preserve system. We started assembling this preserve system. It was adopted in 1996, 97. And a significant amount of this area has been conserved. I'd say of the 200,000 acres that is in that green area, probably 150,000 acres has been conserved. And I want to highlight in particular, bring your attention anyway, in particular to the orange linear areas. Those are regional linkages. And in particular, you can see the one pretty much in the middle of the map has white on either side of it, which is development area. There's a highway that runs through it. It's Interstate 8 for anybody who's familiar with San Diego County. So you can see that when we started this preserve, it was already fairly bisected by development areas. And so these linkages in the middle of the map are the area that I was focused on, or we've been focused on. You can bring up the next map. So here's that same map with kind of our planning area. This is the EHC's focus planning area. And the white area between those two orange regional linkages is not white anymore. It's green now because that's the Crest Ridge Ecological Reserve. And I'll focus some of my conversation tonight on that particular area. Bring up the next slide. Okay, this slide shows Crest Ridge Ecological Reserve in the middle of the map, which was in that white area. And it was not adopted as part of the plan because there was an approved subdivision that preceded the adoption of the MSCP. And that's really what got me started on before EHC was even formed. I was just EHL at the time. But I could see that without significant conservation in this regional linkage landscape, we were going to really not have any wildlife movement across Interstate 8. We're going to have disruption of genetic flow and all the other associated maladies that come with fragmentation, habitat fragmentation, particularly when you're trying to assemble a coherent, interconnected reserve system. So these properties that are named there are some of our early acquisitions to try to build out this linkage area. And that we formed in 2005, the Endangered Habitats Conservancy. So I just was able to pull this map up from something I had in my files. And so this is a map that I put together around 2013, I think. So that's just the early years of EHC doing those acquisitions. the next slide is now going to lead me to a conversation about the Crest Ridge Ecological Reserve, which is our headquarters, and it's also pretty much our flagship organization. And I wanted to use this slide to acknowledge a couple of our partners who are critical in the work that we do, in the conservation work that we do. The Conservation Biology Institute, for anybody who's familiar with them, is pretty much the top of the line in terms of conservation biologists, and as a nonprofit organization. They're headquartered in Corvallis. Jerry Stahlcup was the lead on the MSCP. She was the lead biologist, and she was also the conservation biology representative for Southern California. And then the Earth Discovery Institute is a environmental education program, which is now an independent 501c3. But at the time, in 2002, after Crest Ridge was conserved, which is about when Crest Ridge got conserved, there's quite an interesting story associated with that we may have time to double back on. And I'm going to spend a little bit of time talking about EDI tonight because I'm just so impressed with the work that they do and how effective they've been in really exposing young children to conservation and the outdoors and integration with other educational curriculum and related topics. The next slide, if we could go to that. This is a little bit of what I think you probably would have gathered intuitively when you looked at the map that showed that separation between the two large green areas on the map. Crest Ridge is about 4,000 acres now, so it's a significant piece of land. And I guess I will digress a little bit to the story of Crest Ridge. So, as I mentioned, it had an approved subdivision for 92 estate lots. When I met the property owner, his name is Frank Gatland, and he builds Walmarts. But he bought this property because he built a Walmart down by Interstate 8, and so he had an approved map for the subdivision, and he was ready to build. This was pre-MSCP, so the MSCP had to exclude it from the early maps. And it had an elementary school planned, and I met Frank, really nice guy, Texas guy, gold chains around his neck, wouldn't know a gnatcatcher from an Asian elephant. And we became pretty good friends. I asked him if he would consider selling the property. And he said, well, I guess I would consider it. And over the next couple of years, we were able to assemble the $3 million to buy the property, which in today's acquisition numbers is incredibly, it was 3,000 acres at the time. That's a very small amount of money for what he had, because again, he had an approved map. Crest Ridge has mountain lion. We still have mountain lions. We've got ringtail. We've got badger. So we've got megafauna that is rare and rarely seen in Southern California, or at least in the urban fringe where we are. So it's also got the largest population of lakeside ceanothus, a beautiful ceanothus plant. I should have put a slide up. It's gorgeous. And other species that are kind of critical because of its size, because it's now 4,000 acres, more or less. It's large enough to be a core area, defined term of art in our world, so that species can actually persist here, breed, disperse from here, and so on. So it's located in this critical linkage, and it's large enough to actually sustain a really healthy population and a pretty intact and functional ecosystem. It 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 seems to function as a intact landscape with all the dynamics of such a landscape in play all the time. So it's a pretty special place in that respect. Um, the next slide repeats a little bit of what I said already, but I just wanted to again provide some reference here. So EHL formed in '91. I'm sure Jess has told you about EHL off and on over the years. And in 2002, EHL, because we had just completed the Crest Ridge acquisition, the Earth Discovery Institute was a project of EHL, which Jess probably doesn't even remember. And EHL or EDI, the Earth Discovery Institute, became an independent 501c3 around the same time that Endangered Habitats Conservancy formed. And we formed EHC because I was very frustrated. We were very frustrated with the fact that the county of San Diego, and most of what I'm going to show you tonight is in the unincorporated county of San Diego. They were basically building out their parks program, and they weren't really driven by strategic acquisitions to maintain linkages, to save core populations of species and so on. So I was really frustrated about the lack of strategic progress on assembling the reserve by the county of San Diego. So we formed Endangered Habitats Conservancy to actually work on assembling the preserve. And beyond that, it was our idea at the time, and remains kind of a touchstone, a mission statement, is that we wanted to utilize Crest Ridge as a location to set the standards for MSCP implementation. So management, monitoring, species recovery, and I include environmental education and public use. Public use is a real challenging issue, which you're probably familiar with on any conserved lands, particularly sensitive conserved lands. And it remains a big issue, 30 years on in San Diego County and Orange County and elsewhere. So I'll talk a little bit about that, but the idea of creating EHC is basically to give EHL standing when we would be arguing on land use decisions and science-based decisions in the MSCP and things like that, so that we could say, yeah, well, we are managing land, we are monitoring species and landscapes, and we do have an environmental education program, and we do allow public use. So we have standing to argue and try to set the highest standards that we can. And I think we've been very successful in that regard. Particularly now, I'm in some hand-to-hand combat with the county on public use and that sort of thing. And Crest Ridge for decades and decades was basically just public open space. It was an original Mexican land grant, or part of it, and part of one. And the community of Crest, where I live, had used this reserve as a playground. There was a half a dozen buildings on the property, motorcycles everywhere, not a lot of care for the land, to put it mildly. So when we first started, after we conserved the property, there was a lot of, 20 years really of trying to get our arms around the public use component of this, to control it and to preserve the sensitive areas and to educate the public and so on. And over the years, we've really developed some key lessons learned, which I'll touch on a little bit later, about how to move a conserved open space area from significant degradation and abuse to one that is pretty much treasured by the local community, a large sense of ownership about the preserve, and we've made a lot of progress in that regard. I intentionally advocated for, and it's hard to believe that I'm saying this, but I advocated for allowing mountain bikes, because mountain bikes were taking off at the time, and they had already been all over the preserve. And I wanted to basically utilize this acquisition in a manner that would demonstrate if and how mountain bikes can be allowed on preserved lands. And EHC owns over 10,000 acres of land now, and Crest Ridge is the only one where we allow mountain bikes, and really the only one that has any public access at all. But in this regard, it remains a long working relationship with the mountain bike folks. They've become really sensitive and helpful to managing the land, sensitive to how they use the bikes, and we've basically changed every social trail and alignment that was on the preserve. It was a spider web of trails and roads and whatnot, none of which made any sense, none of which were engineered to reduce erosion, the usual story on social trails. And so we have over the years replaced, eliminated, or rerouted all the trails on Crest Ridge. And now we have a multi-use preserve. We allow equestrians, mountain bikes, and hikers. Our trails are, 18 inches wide, and we have not yet had, over 20 years, we have not yet had any significant, or really anything that I can think of, confrontation or accident between mountain bikes, equestrians, and hikers. So it is possible to actually be civilized and careful and caring on a reserve system. And so that's been a focus of ours. I would say the last 2 years, we've completely, with a few rare exceptions, completely eliminated any dogs off leash. Dogs are allowed at the reserve, but only, of course, leashed. And that was a long, long haul to get everybody on the same page with regard to that, but it's worked over time. Let's go to the next slide. So I've already mentioned the CBI, the Conservation Biology Institute. I actually live on the preserve, and it's one of the lessons learned that for these large preserve areas, you really need to have somebody, if possible, somebody living on site. We've had a lot of, mountain bikers at one point were coming out here to ride at night, and I would confront them. And after a while, they just finally figured, well, there's this old weird guy, and he's going to come hit us up if we're out riding at night. And we got the word out among the peer group, among the mountain bikers, because they, of course, have their own social network, and it has stopped. So we no longer have any night riders here. One of the things I wanted to bring up, it's worth an entire presentation at some point, but wearing my EHL hat, I worked with SANDAG, which is our local MPO municipal planning organization, which usually focuses on transportation related issues, and worked with them on a ballot measure and was able to generate $880 million for conservation out of that half-cent sales tax, which was the ballot measure. And out of that, $4 million a year has been allocated to create the San Diego Management and Monitoring Program, SDMMP. And it is state-of-the-art conservation biology and science, applied science. And it's the most amazing organization that I've ever been around. It's completely apolitical. It seems to have never been politicized. It includes the wildlife agencies and all the jurisdictions and the NGOs and at some point, as a matter of fact, you could actually Google SDMMP and go on their webpage and see a little bit of what they do, including setting protocols for monitoring and survey work and working on invasives and linkage function and wildfire recovery and climate change. Those are all separate areas of study and analysis and applied science. And they have used Crest Ridge and the Greater Crest Ridge Ecological Reserve, which includes other lands. And the Conservation Biology Institute created this document called the Greater Crest Ridge Framework Management Plan, which is that acronym there under the third bullet. And that is now used as a reference document, a model for creating consistent management plans. We have, dozens and dozens of management plans in the preserve system run by different jurisdictions, different agencies, different NGOs. And so there has to be consistency among and between those management plans, and the consistency is generated from SDMMP. So it's really an amazing organization. I'm part of a California coalition of HCPs and NCCPs, and also part of a national coalition. And I can say really pretty confidently that there's no science-based conservation, regional conservation entity like SDMMP in the whole country. It's really an amazing advance in the world of conservation biology. I'm going to touch on, okay, I already mentioned the equestrians, mountain bikes, and hiking. We've probably done about 20 acquisitions or so since we started trying to build out that map that I showed earlier in the presentation. And we can go to the next slide. And so this is a map of Crest Ridge. It's a number of years old, but it shows the point I want to make. You can see Interstate 8, and over on the right-hand side, which is the east, you can see the Crest Ridge goes right down to Interstate 8. That tan yellow color is an acquisition, and that wedge between on the east end is now filled in. And so this is a trails map, and you can see what's here now, which is about 1/10 of what was here before, and virtually nothing in the eastern side of the reserve, probably 1,500 to 2,000 acres over there. And that's just refugia for wildlife. And really one of the lessons learned, regardless of how large or small a preserve is, there really has to be an area with no human access, if at all possible. Because regardless of how quiet and sensitive and caring people are, particularly a public area, it's incredibly disruptive to wildlife. And there's a lot of advanced study over the last 10 years on public use impacts to conserved areas, which is a topic worthy of a whole presentation. The next couple slides, I made separate slides because I didn't know how to put them all on the same slide. So I'm going to now touch on the Earth Discovery Institute a little bit because I'm so proud of the organization. And EDI is an organization that focuses on under-resourced schools. In San Diego, we call them the South of Interstate 8 schools, and works with about 5,000 kids a year, 11 different schools. And Crest Ridge is one of the places that they come to do their environmental education, but they're not just doing busy work, they're actually implementing our management plan. So they're doing invasive plant control. They're planting purple needle grass. We've got a whole meadow here that they've been working on for 10 years, and propagate oaks, Engelmann and Coast live oak, and that kind of work. And one of the things I just kind of accidentally bumped into, another lesson learned, is that a couple years in, they also do cross curricula work. So they do artwork, but artwork based on their experience at the reserve. And some of the artwork that the kids have done is just amazing in my view. I mean, it's really pure. And we use the kids' artwork for trail signs and whatnot. And it's like, if you design a reserve or a public use area, design it for kids or for a mom with 2 young children, you pretty much, it's kind of like garlic to the bad guys. We had vandalism, we had all kinds of crazy stuff going on in the early years. And we have a storybook hike now, and we've got all our trail signs or the artwork from the kids, and it just seems to set a tone that actually seems to create the right vibe and is a very positive thing. So the next 2 slides are just examples of that. And then slide number 13 is it's a little building designed by James Hubble that we use with the kids, or public can go in there, and there's some shady areas to sit. It's much more grown in than this picture even shows. So it's a nice space to let the kids hang out. They're pretty fascinated by the construction. It's a straw bale building. Next is I want to share some of my observations from living on the reserve. Are we all on the same slide here, the red diamondback rattlesnake? Hello?
That should be what's popping up on everyone's screen.
I'm sorry?
That should be popping up on the share screen, unless it's, as long as everyone else can see it, it's showing up on mine.
You are seeing that. You are seeing the correct slide.
Nice, okay.
Have you been seeing my slides as we've been going along?
Yes.
Okay, good. Okay, the reason I'm gonna now spend a few minutes talking about the snakes here, because it's kind of fascinating, or it has been for me. So this guy was actually in my driveway. He's 15-year-old red diamondback, one of the mellowest, certainly the mellowest rattlesnake I've ever met. And because I have dogs, I had to take him to this release area, but he came back a couple times. Just really a cool, mellow snake. The next one is Pacific, as you recognize it. And then that's followed by the speckled, which is one of the most beautiful animals I've ever seen. I brought this one in the house so I could take a picture of it against the rug.
Wow.
And the last image is, and can you expand that image with your cursor? This is the largest by 2 times the largest gopher snake I've ever seen. Pretty amazing, isn't it? Anyway, the reason I wanted to bring up the rattlesnakes is I've been here now living on the reserve for probably 15 years. And I've seen the population dynamics of different species fluctuate as they will. But the rattlesnakes have been particularly interesting. I probably see about between 25 and 30 rattlesnakes a year. It's a perfect rattlesnake property. And in the early years, I'd say 90% of the snakes were Pacific uh, rattlesnakes, and they're pretty bad attitude snakes, easy to just disturb them. And there were a few, but rare red diamondbacks. I'd never seen a Western diamondback, but I've now seen a couple. And the speckled were particularly rare. And now 15 years later, that ratio has completely flipped. Now the most common snake, rattlesnake, here is the speckled, followed by the ruber, the red diamondback. And like I said, I've only seen 2 Western, and the Pacific are now probably 20-25% of the snakes I see. So for whatever reason, their populations have shifted. The next slide, I want to focus now on gnat catchers and some of the other properties. So Crest Ridge is that bow tie looking place over on the lower right-hand side of this screen. And other projects, other properties rather, that you can see on this display are other properties that we purchased. And this is when I was trying to get the funding to purchase Lakeside Downs, which is in the middle of that map. And we were successful. And so I was just kind of making the case about Crest Ridge linkage. So that early map that I showed you with the 2 orange linkage areas, one of those, we'll revisit that, but one of those is a gnatcatcher linkage. And it's basically referred to as the gnatcatcher archipelago because it's a stepping stone arrangement across Interstate 8. And it's really the only place for gnatcatchers to get across Interstate 8. In the early MSCP days, in the very early planning days even, there was real concern that the gnatcatcher populations were going to be completely severed because it was such a tenuous linkage across Interstate 8. So that's one of the areas we focused on from Crest Ridge. And so we bought the Hanson property, Lakeside Ranch, Lakeside Downs, and some others. So I'm going to speak to a couple of these properties now. The next slide, I just have to show you because it's such a gorgeous picture. This is the Hanson Pond property, which is on that map you just looked at, or on that aerial image that you just saw. This is a 150-acre property, and the water that you see here is part of a 40-acre pond, which is the result of a sand mining operation decades ago. And we bought it from Hanson Aggregates. And it's an amazing, amazing property. You can't see it in this picture, but we designed and built, did a major restoration, about a $4 million restoration to create a habitat island for tricolor blackbird so that they would have a moat around their home if they would show up, and they have, but this property also has vireos, gnatcatchers, cactus wren. We're doing a major cactus wren restoration right now. Orange-throated whiptail, coast horn lizard, a lot of our MSCP covered species. And it's part of this long effort. I don't know, seems like forever effort. I've been working on the El Monte Valley. But this picture was just taken this year, and I wanted to share that with you. What you're looking at is actually the surface of the San Diego River, which is ephemeral in most of the areas. But this is the actual aquifer of the San Diego River. The next slide is coming back to a slide that you've already seen, but I brought it back up because I wanted to point out 2 areas. So at the top on the left-hand side of that, where it says Lakeside Down Santee, I'm going to show you a little bit of that area in the next slide. And then After that, if you go down to the opposite corner of the map, or it says skyline, I'll show you that as well. So you can see, you will see anyway, how starting with this core acquisition of properties around Crest Ridge, we're expanding to create habitat linkages up and down the MSCP South area. So the next slide is that Santee area that I mentioned. This is a property that we're actually working on pretty continuously because those north of Magnolia parcels are, as you can see, very small. Those are anywhere from 2 to 10 acres, and all the colored parcels are properties that we purchased. Different colors represent different acquisitions, and we're actually working on one right now that's blocked in there in black. But that's part of this gnatcatcher linkage that moves from that previous map I showed you, or that circle map. Well, by the way, that light area in the circle map, can we go back to that, which is slide number 18? Is that up?
Yep, the circle map, slide number 18 is up.
Yeah, great, thanks. So I'll reference this again. So that light shaded area is kind of the typical dispersal area for gnatcatchers, 1.5 miles or so. And all those arrows I put together in this pretty primitive exhibit, but to show how all these properties are connected. And if you look at Lakeside Downs in the middle of that map, that little arrow, the smallest arrow to the left of it, is what I was just referring to when I mentioned north of Magnolia. And then Finita Ranch, which is a whole story unto itself, and Miramar, the naval base over there, Miramar. So this is how we're connecting gnatcatchers and other birds and wildlife, of course, but focused on gnatcatchers in this regard. So now if we can go back to, back to that map. So Lakeside Downs is about 600 acres, and it's consistently has 6 pair of gnatcatchers, and you guys are all Audubon folks, so you know that 6 pair of gnatcatchers anywhere is a big deal. And we're not along the coast here, so it's pretty encouraging that we consistently have gnatcatchers there. And virtually all of these parcels north of Magnolia, the gnatcatchers are just flying back and forth across all these properties. So this is, before there was any development in San Diego, this is a major regional gnatcatcher linkage. And we just kind of discovered it by chance, basically through the acquisition of these properties. And EHC is committed to making the connections all the way across this north of Magnolia area into Finita Ranch and Miramar, and we'll get there. Okay, the next map, if you recall the lower right-hand corner of map number 20, let's go back to that just for the heck of it. So where it says skyline, now we can go to 22. So this is another property that is one that we've been working on for about 10 years, or a set of properties, I should say, about 10 years. And you can see how strategically important the Skyline South and Skyline North areas are in terms of linking up conserved lands. So we finished Skyline South a couple years ago. It was 4 separate acquisitions, really gnarly process, but eventually we're able to conserve all of that. And that's one of the historic Hermes copper butterfly populations. That's why we bought the property. And when we started, of course, Hermes was not listed. It's subsequently been listed. We were pretty involved in that process. And so we were able to purchase Skyline South, which was not burned in either of our two major fires that we've had on our properties. And Hermes copper butterfly is very cryptic. It doesn't, I don't think any butterfly can escape any of these wildfires we have, but they don't recover. And so there's a lot of effort going into trying to translocate the eggs from underneath a red berry bush leaf. I mean, it's an incredible effort to try to preserve this population of butterflies, which is on the verge of extinction. Although last year, we discovered a new population in East County, which has, I don't know, 40 or 50 butterflies, which is amazing. That's 10 times the amount we usually find on any of these properties. Crestridge used to have Hermes copper butterfly, but 98% of Crestridge burned in the Cedar Fire in 2003. And so everything that, well, you haven't seen too many landscape pictures tonight from Crestridge, but it's really recovered wonderfully. And so I wanted to share this strategic map with you as well. I'm getting to the end here. The next slide is Hermes copper butterfly, one of the great photos of Hermes. Dan Marshalak, anybody who's working on Hermes knows Dan's name. He's the man. Very, very dedicated to preserving this species. The next slide is out of San Diego. This is actually a project that we've been working on for about 10 years. This is on the Russian River in Sonoma County, the Middle Reach, which is the alluvial floodplain area, historically alluvial floodplain area of the Russian River. And these ponds are the result of sand mining operation by Hanson Aggregates. And if you recall, that was one of the San Diego properties of that real nice picture I showed you. And I have a really good working relationship with them. And Marvin one day said, "Hey, we've got this property on the Russian River and we're just finishing up our mining, and I think it should be conserved instead of reclaimed." And got a dog looking for attention. And so we are buying this property and restoring it, basically going to create a functional floodplain and reconnect the floodplain to the river. And the existing regulations, if you're familiar with sand mining operations or anything like that, they require that there's a revetment, a levee and revetment between the river and the ponds so that the ponds don't capture the river and create chaos and so on, that whole story. So we've been working for a number of years with NIMS and other entities, but primarily Brian Klur with National Marine Fisheries Service, hydrogeomorphologist, a brainiac, a brilliant guy. And he's our lead scientist on this project. And we are going to be restoring this to a functional floodplain, opening up the river and the floodplain so that first year fish are able, salmon are able to get out of the rushing river and get into a nursery area so that they can gain enough weight to survive the ocean migration. And it's really, I've gone to school on this, of course, over the years, and floodplains, everybody listening to me now is probably familiar with the fact that floodplains are the ignored part of riverine systems, because historically, particularly development projects, and in this case, vineyards, are built right up against the river, and the floodplain function is lost, which has huge impacts on migratory fish species and everything. And so we will be restoring this to a self-sustaining river system. We're actually towards the end of our process. We're getting through CEQA and final design phases, and probably start implementation in the next little over a year, maybe 18 months. And this will be done in 4 phases. It's about 4 million cubic yards of fill to fill those ponds and to create the appropriate elevations and hydrology for a functional floodplain, which is shown in just a very schematic diagram in the next slide, which is almost my last slide. And the light green is going to be the floodplain. Those channels are there for the water the water actually backs into this floodplain area because of a geologic constraint about a mile down called the Wohler Narrows in the Russian River. And so the water actually backs in to flood the floodplain, and it will go dry during the summer months. So because right now those ponds are full of bass and other bad things, including methylmercury, and they're just bad at many levels ecologically. And so these channels will allow fish to retreat back into the river as the system dries out during its annual cycle. And so this could be a whole nother presentation. Actually, there's a lot of fascinating story here. And then we can go to the last slide, which is there. So that's it. Hello? Hello?
Yes.
Bravo, Michael.
I'd clap again. Yeah.
Yes, can't hear the audience is clapping, but the audience is giving an applause.
You know, I have to say it's pretty weird giving a PowerPoint and not knowing. I mean, it's like I'm talking in a closet because I don't see anybody, and I can't tell if you're even hearing what I'm saying. It's kind of strange.
No, it was all good. We heard you clear the whole time.
Oh, good. Okay, so I don't know if there's any questions or anybody wants to chat about any of it, but there it is.
Do you want to get? Whoa.
I'm getting feedback from Anne's computer right now.
Is this better yet?
It was still, when you unmuted Julian, I still heard some feedback.
Is the feedback coming on my end?
Yes,
No,
it
it's just,
Mute your Zoom, Michael.
Okay,
Oh.
wait a second. I'm gonna.
I don't think it's.
How's that?
Can you hear me now?
Yes.
Okay, I turned my speaker off, but I
How's
think this
is that
might be
better?
clear. Is the feedback on?
Can we hear it without feedback?
yes. Yep, everyone's good now.
We can hear
Okay.
you.
Okay. And you want to?
Oh, I think we're having some more feedback. Maybe if Michael, I think that your audio is feeding back into your mic, so we're getting feedback of anyone who tries talking that's at Madrona right now. So maybe
Oh.
if you temporarily mute your mic in the bottom left of your Zoom window
Oh,
while
right.
questions are being asked.
Oh, yeah, that makes sense. I don't know what. Oh, that's my PowerPoint.
Okay, can everybody hear me? No feedback. Good. So we had something in the chat, but it seems to gone. Anybody here have questions that they'd like to ask Michael?
if Michael would talk a little bit about what the MSC.
I personally lost it on the acronym.
Relationship between
I think you just-
NCCP and MSCP.
Okay, did you hear that, Michael?
No, would you repeat the question?
Michael, you might say something about the relationship between the NCCP and MSCP, just what the initials are and the relationship.
Okay, yeah, the NCCP is the Natural Communities Conservation Plan, and that's the state conservation strategy, which actually, when it was initiated during, I think, Governor Wilson's era, if you can believe that, was really an empty shell of a program. It had no biological standards to speak of. Everything was voluntary. It was basically just an end around to avoid, to make findings that you could avoid endangered species and so on. Then when the gnatcatcher was listed, which is the reason the EHL formed, the NCCP became pretty real. And the first multi-jurisdictional NCCP was the MSCP in San Diego County. And the original South County plan had 5 jurisdictions: the city of San Diego, the county of San Diego, city of Chula Vista, city of Poway, and the city of Santee. And since then, we have so that's the South County plan. And then there's the North County plan, which you saw on that earlier map, and the East County. So the MSCP stands for Multiple Species Conservation Program.
Any other questions?
I would like to say,
My talk, Gibson. And
We're getting
Go ahead.
some in-person feedback. We also did have a comment though from Zoom.
Interaction between you and Gibson and the first acquisition.
Michael,
We had
Okay,
trouble.
I'm gonna mute and listen to a question and then
Michael,
unmute.
I was suggesting that you describe the Gibson acquisition just as the first acquisition and how things started and how things changed.
Yeah, well, that was the Crest Ridge, like I said, was proposed for development and already had an improved subdivision and was well on its way to being developed, which would have been, especially in retrospect, would have just wiped out this linkage, and it would have been impossible to kind of create what we've been able to around it. So the implication is that it became the core, the body, the corpus of this whole core and linkage area. And one of the anecdotes, this is just happenstance, but like I mentioned that there was a elementary school that was part of the subdivision and it was approved. And I thought, first I was trying to talk Frank into selling the place, and he said, well, I've got to build a school here. They're not going to give up on their school. They're getting a free school out of this deal. And I met with the superintendent of the school district. And as it turns out, she was quite a conservationist, and said, well, let me see what I can, let me crunch some numbers, this and that and the other thing. And eventually she signed off on no school. So that was a pretty amazing, rare outcome from that conversation. And really everything, it just kind of built from Crest Ridge in terms of the acquisitions, because we were able to now demonstrate to the funding agencies, WCB in particular, that this strategy is going to be long-term, but we're going to stay with it and we're going to get all these acquisitions done. I maybe could mention, it's kind of a side issue, but our funding, we've probably purchased, I don't know, $100 million worth of land, something like that, I would guess. And our funding comes from WCB, Section 6, if you're familiar with that program, a federal program of funding. Sandag, I mentioned them earlier, and also the military. We've done a couple of large acquisitions in partnership with the military under the REPI program, and they are really, really great partners in San Diego County. They're really green. They really do care about their natural resources. So we've got Pendleton, of course, Miramar. Thank God for both of them, because those are just huge open areas in the middle of San Diego or at the top of San Diego. And then we have some other facilities. So we've got really great partners with the military. And I don't know, Jess, did that cover your question or not? Maybe I missed it.
It's specifically your relationships with Gibson. Oh,
With
their relationship with Gibson.
well, are you talking about John Gibson?
Are you talking about John Gibson? John Gibson?
Yeah, the first acquisition, first individual property.
First property acquired from Gibson.
Well, I'm not sure where Jess is going with this, but John Gibson owned a property adjacent to Crest Ridge, and he didn't like me at all. He knew me by reputation, busybody enviro, hates development, you know, had that whole kind of deal. And I was on the planning commission, so he really didn't like me. And eventually we got to know each other. Can't remember exactly what initiated that first conversation, but we got to know each other. We became pretty good friends, and he was part of this coalition of East County construction guys. These guys all went to high school together, and now they're, you know, 50 years old and all developers. And, you know, in the early MSCP days, the developers hated the MSCP. They hated the enviros. It was pretty toxic relationships all over the place. Anyway, John and I got to know each other, and, you know, would have breakfast and talk. And eventually we ended up buying probably about 400 acres of his properties. The first one was his own personal property, 250 acres. And when he realized that we were actually legitimate business people, because we're spending a lot of money and we're fair market value, highest and best use, you know, we're very transparent, and we can generate real money, and it's all cash at closing, which developers usually have contingencies up the kazoo. So I still have relationships with a half a dozen of those guys. John ended up moving to Texas, and he calls me occasionally just to tell me how quickly it, how the fact that he got a permit to build a subdivision in 2 weeks in Texas. But anyway, I'm not sure if that's the Gibson story you were referring to, Jess, or not. Okay. Anyway, I will say this, after all these years, now 3 decades doing this, conservation, probably like anything, it's all about relationships. I mean, our relationship with the wildlife agency, with elected officials, with regulatory agencies, as those relationships go, so goes conservation.